Hear the word of the Lord from Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. As they were walking along, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" "Well," they replied, "some say John the Baptist. Some say Elijah. Others say you are one of the other prophets." Then he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples and then reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. When I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to intern at my home church. And much like the disciple journey that we're talking about, I had many older pastors there who were able to mentor me and to train me, and they all had different gifts and personalities, and I was able to learn different things from each and every one of them, and it was an absolute blessing that has proved fruitful in my ministry. One of the main mentors was my senior pastor, and at that point he had been at our church for over 40 years. It was like 18 people when he showed up, and it was over 1,000 in a town of maybe 7,000 people. So he had this long, impactful ministry, and I was eager to learn from him. And so I met with him every week, and I had different subjects I had to come up because of my coursework, come up with questions to ask, and there were many really important topics that we had to cover because it was just one summer. But there was one question that I had hoped that I would be able to ask him at some point. And I was hopeful that it was kind of a weird question, and I thought, I can't really put this in my coursework, but it's something I really want to know. And it was this: how do you know everybody's name? Because he knew everybody's name. Didn't matter who they were. We'd see people in town, and he had been there so long, he just knew everybody. And I want to know what his trick was, how he did that. So I was kind of hoping and waiting for the right time, the right opportunity to be able to ask him that. So later in the summer, I had a chance to go visiting with him. We went into the hospitals, and I watched how he did that and learned from him. It was one of the main emphasis of my internship. And as we were walking through the halls of one of the hospital, this couple stopped him, and they began to talk to him. They greeted him and started to talk about their mom, and they had this 5-minute conversation back and forth. These weren't people that went to the church. And I thought, this is my chance, right? I'm going to ask him, these aren't people that you see all the time. How do you know all these people? How do you know all their names? So they finished their conversation. We're walking down the hall, and I was kind of thinking in my mind, how am I going to segue this? How am I going to ask this question? And he turns to me, and he says, "Hey, do you have any idea who those people were?" So I didn't need to ask the question. I got the answer. But that points us to a bigger question today. And that points us to the question we ask of ourselves, the question of who we are. Do we know who we are? Do we know our identity and who we are in Christ? We spend years trying to discover that for ourselves, and the world will provide us answers. The world puts labels on us. The world characterizes us. It segments us into different groups. It says, if you're a part of this group, then I know who you are. Here's your identity. If you're part of this group, I know who you are. Here's your identity. We define ourselves with these labels, and that becomes who we think we are. But in what we find is all the world's answers don't answer that question for us. People are told who they are in our world, and yet they struggle with this. They have no idea who they really are at heart. And they struggle through their lives to discover their identity, who they're meant to be. In the Gospel of Mark, we see the disciples wrestling with their identity, but also with the identity of Jesus. If you remember last week in Mark chapter 4, when Jesus performs this miracle, and he calms the wind and the waves with but a word, the disciples ask this question: who is this man? Who is he? And it's a question that they're struggling with. It's a question that we probably all struggle with on our journey with Jesus at some point, trying to understand who he is. In the passage that we just read, Jesus asks them the question about who people say that he is and who they think that he is. And then he begins to define that for them. And as we look at this passage a little closer in the verses that follow it, we see Jesus provide us answers to the two questions that we really ask. Who is Jesus, and who am I? And what we find is, in answering the first question, is when you can come to really understand the answer to the second question. Is in understanding who Jesus is, that you can come to understand who you are and who God has created you to be. So let's look at Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Let's listen to these questions of identity that Jesus puts to his disciples and answers for us. We saw in the beginning of that passage that Jesus begins here as they're traveling by asking them, who do people say that I am? What are the labels that people have put on me? People are talking about Jesus. People are asking the questions. So he wants to know, what have you heard? And so they give him some answers. Elijah, John the Baptist, which that one doesn't even make sense, does it? Like they were in the same place at the same time. How are they the same person? But it's an answer they gave. One of the other prophets. And so they've heard all these ways, and they've struggled with themselves. Who is this man? And so now Jesus puts the question to them, who do you say that I am? And Peter makes this confession for the first time. You are the Messiah. The chosen one, the anointed one. So ask yourself this, what does that mean? What does Peter mean by that word? We use that word a lot. When Peter says it, what does he mean? When he says chosen or anointed one, what are they chosen for? What is he anointed for? He is chosen and anointed to be the king. That's what Peter's saying. You are the king that we've been promised, the king we've been waiting for, the king we've expected, the king we've hoped for, the king that's going to make all this right. Peter says that's who you are. And so what Jesus says, one, Jesus never tells them that. Notice that. Jesus does not walk around the countryside saying, hey, everybody, my name's Jesus, I'm the Messiah. It's not how he works. Other people say it. John the Baptist say it. People whisper it. Peter says it, but Jesus doesn't. Jesus doesn't say it. Jesus shows them. Through how he lived, through how he taught, through what he does. He demonstrates that he has all the qualities that the scriptures had said would be true of this chosen one. And so when Peter says this, Peter already has this idea in his brain of what that means. Just like we talked about the labels of the world, the Messiah was a label to them. They'd identified, if he's the Messiah, here's what it means. But Jesus then does this. It says here, when Peter says this, it shifts how Jesus talks to his disciples. Because the next passage says, Jesus begins to explain to them what would happen. Not again, but begins. At this point, when he says, Peter says, you're the Messiah, Jesus says, let me tell you what that means. Let me tell you what that looks like. I'm going to suffer and die. But that's not exactly right, is it? Look at the words. Jesus says, I must be rejected by the leaders. I must be scorned and mocked. I must die a cruel death on a cross. And I must rise again. That's what it means for me to be king. Jesus is telling them what his kingly reign will look like. I must do these things. It's not a prediction. It's not a prophecy of sorts. It's not Jesus saying, this is what I hope to achieve in my kingship. This is Jesus telling them, if that's true, if I am the Messiah, if I am who you are saying I am, this is what must happen. Peter's reaction is to tell Jesus, no, that's not what it's going to look like. He reprimands him. What's the word in this translation? The word is rebuke. It's the same word we've talked about each week. It's the same word that is used to talk about how Jesus cast out demons, and the same word it's used to describe how Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves. With the strongest language possible, Peter says, no, that's not what being a Messiah means. And so it flips it. Jesus rebukes Peter then. Same word. He turns the tables on Peter to say what? Peter, you are looking at this through your eyes, through human eyes. You are explaining what you want out of a king. Here's what the Messiah means for you and what you want him to achieve for you, that you are looking at it through your perspective and not God's perspective. You are seeing who I am through your eyes. And how often do we make the same mistake? We answer the question who Jesus is, not based on who he really is, and not based on who he's promised to be, but on who we want him to be. Who we wish that he were in our lives. And people come to Jesus longing for him to be something that he never promised them to be. The truth is, what he promised them is so much more than what they come to him expecting. Who is Jesus? It's not a question that you get to answer. It's a question that Jesus has answered for us. That he's shown us through what he has said and what he has done. Peter sees the kind of king he wants, that he needs, that he believes they need. But Jesus tells them, no, this is the king you must have. Once Jesus makes it clear who he is, that he's the Messiah who must suffer, he then turns that same question on them. That's who I am, now who are you? Because remember that first week we talked about discipleship. To be a disciple, to follow means what? Your end goal is to imitate the teacher, the master. So if he must suffer and he must die, what does it mean to become like him? That's what Jesus explains to them next, who they are. Listen to the words that he speaks to them, beginning verse 34, I'm sorry. Then Jesus, calling to the crowd to join his disciples, he says, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but you lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his fathers with the holy angels. So Jesus tells them that their identity will be shaped by who he is, by his identity. He's revealed the kind of king he is, so now he reveals what his followers look like. And he says 5 simple things. Not simple, easy to see what he says here. Not simple to do. First, he says they must turn from their selfish ways. Give up their own ways. And that is a very easy, polite way to say what the words say. That the verb that's used there means to despise or reject yourself. I fully reject me. That's the first step in following. You give up your life, your will, your way. You reject that completely. That's the start. Then he says, then take up your cross. Now, that becomes flowery language for us. Taking up your cross is a metaphor. We talk about the cross that we bear, and we're talking about our problems and our struggles and our heartaches and all these hard things that we go through, or something that's just true of our lives that we struggle with. Oh, that's the cross that I bear. Understand this. The cross was not a metaphor for the people that Jesus spoke to. The cross was a cruel torture device used to show political power and authority. When the Romans put you on the cross, it was the Romans saying, we're in charge and you're not. So when Jesus calls them to take up their cross, it is not some metaphor for sacrifice. Taking up your cross is nothing short of giving up your life. When they hear that, they know that. It is not some big metaphor for us. We have rejected ourselves to the point where we are willing to give up our lives. To do what? What's next? To follow Him. Because if we're following Him and His path leads to Calvary and the cross, so does ours. See, Jesus is not this king who sits on a throne and brings a bunch of soldiers in to just do what He asks. So many of you veterans that stood up, you were asked to do things that your commanding officers probably never would or weren't willing to do. That's not true of our king. Our king asks us to give up everything, and He gave up everything first. He asks us to submit to the will of the Father, but He submitted to the will of the Father first. He asks us to take up a cross, but He took up a cross for us first. He isn't a king who asks us to deny and to submit to authority on our own. We are following Him in doing that. We are only doing what He has already done for us. This is not a metaphor. This is daily lived surrender. So that finally the result is that we lose ourselves. We've rejected ourselves. We've taken up the cross. We follow Him. And we lose ourselves. Now listen to me. Here's what Jesus says. You want to read between the lines. What He says is this. You're going to lose yourself no matter what. You can try to hold on to it. You can try to hold on to your life. And what happens? Jesus' words. You'll lose it. You can try to cling to that life. You're going to lose it. It's going to be taken from you. So He says instead, what I'm asking is that you give it up. And when you give up the life, what happens? That's when you really find it. That's when you find what life really is. Trusting in the things of this world, trying to hold on to them, will bring you nothing. When we deny ourselves, when we take up that cross, we're giving up ourselves. We're giving up the things of this world that have defined us, that become our identity, that we use to define ourselves. We're giving all that up and allowing ourselves to be defined by who Jesus is. We cling to what we know, and when we do that, we lose our very souls. The alternative is we let it go. And we gain a victory in Christ. And so what that ends with is Jesus calls us to courage. The last verse. To not be ashamed of who He is and what He's done. He didn't only say that He must suffer and die. He said that He must be raised up again. He must be victorious in the end. To be who God has promised. And that day will come where He stands victorious over all things. And He will not acknowledge those who gave up on His kingdom before it came in its fullness. We acknowledge Jesus in our sacrifice for Him now, and He acknowledges us in His victory. So we began with the question about who Jesus is. Who do you say that I am? But Jesus ends up using that to talk about who we are and the question of our identity. And we see that question isn't answered by job titles or labels or descriptions. This is an identity question. It defines who you are, what gives you your sense of worth, what makes you feel valuable. And people will often say, if I just had that, if I achieved that, if I got that promotion, if I got that new job, if I got that spouse that I was looking for, if I was older, if I was younger, if I was smarter, if I had more money, if I had this, if I had that, then that's when I'd find meaning. But what all that means is you are basing your identity on your achievements, on your performance, on your possessions, and those things will change. If your identity is in your job, what happens when your company closes? What happens when you get laid off? What happens when you retire? You lose your identity with it. If your identity is in a task or an action or something that makes you feel good about yourself, and then you can't do that thing anymore, what happens? Your identity crashes. When you build your identity on someone else, on someone you love, on a relationship with them, and then something happens to that relationship, what happens? Your identity crashes. These are these things that we achieve, that we do, that we succeed at. They all change. And when they change, then who are we? I don't know who I am anymore. We are people who live in a constant identity crisis because you haven't found your identity in the only thing that won't crash, that won't change, that won't fade away. So the mistake people make is they say this, well, then I'm going to base my life on God. I'm going to build my life on God, right? And then they start, I'm going to go to church, and I'm going to do good things, and I'm going to pray more, and I'm going to read the Bible, and I'm going to do all this. Well, I will build my life. Who's my identity found in? Me. And I've just exchanged the actions of this world for holy actions that I'm using in the wrong way. But I'm still the determiner of it. You can do all the right things. You can have all the right things that you can truly find identity in. But if they are the things that we base who we are on, you're missing out. They'll change. They'll crash. We think we have to become this good person, religious person. It's performance-based, and it doesn't work. We sing that song, Build My Life. I will build my life. If that was the end of the line, the song would be wrong. But it says this, I will build my life on your love, on the love of God. That is the firm foundation. Because what we're saying there is I'm not building it on things that I'm doing. I'm building it on what Jesus has done. On how He's shown me His love in the cross. That's what gives my life meaning. That's what gives my life purpose. That's who determines who I am in Christ Jesus. And nothing I have, and nothing I do, and nothing anybody else calls me can ever decide who I am, if I am His. Our identity isn't something we construct. Our identity is something we receive at the cross. And the moment that our self-made identity falls apart is often the very moment that Jesus is finally free to rebuild it in His image. Not on what we do, but based on what He's already done. Our identity as disciples should be found in the cross of Jesus. In the King, the Anointed One, who did all that He said He must do. Nothing should make you feel more valuable than that. More than you are a son or a daughter or a wife or a husband or whatever other job title or label that you have. You are a child of God, created in His image. The question is, will you allow that to be your identity? Will you live as His child? Will you be a part of His family? Will you surrender the life that you're building for yourself, that you'll lose, that fades away, to grab a hold of the life that He has won for you at Calvary, that an empty tomb has promised you for eternity? In the 60s, many year round. Do we have anybody here that would have been called a hippie? Couple of you. Phil, are you all right? In the 60s, when the hippies are often, like in California, lived in the same neighborhoods. And in San Francisco and California, particularly, where they lived in this neighborhood, Asbury Heights, became too costly for them to live there anymore, so they had to move. And so what happened is many of them moved down the road to Santa Cruz, where it was a little more affordable. Well, when that happened, they started life there. They got married, they had kids, they got jobs, right? They started their life that way. And eventually what they saw was this. The kindergartens in Santa Cruz were no longer filled with Melissa and Brett. The children started to come in being named Moonbeam and Precious Promise, right? And for so long that they just became accustomed to, we don't know what names are going to come through this door. We don't know what names these who were hippies when these kids were born, what they named them. So what they did was they had the parents write the name on a name tag before they sent them to school. Put the name tag on them, put them on the bus, send them to school. And that way when they get off the bus, everybody can use their name. And so the kindergarten teachers had no idea what to expect coming off that bus. That's when we meet a little boy named Fruit Stand. Fruit Stand walked off that bus, and the teachers thought this one's a little different. This was even worse than the other ones. But hey, it really wasn't any weirder than the rest, and so they said, we're so glad to have you in our class, Fruit Stand. Would you like to play with blocks, Fruit Stand? Do you want a snack, Fruit Stand? And the little boy was pretty hesitant. He was shy, didn't talk, never answered. Eventually, he would respond in some way, never with a word. And by the end of the day, they just got used to it, right? It became like all the other names. Then they got to send him home on the bus. It's time to go home, and they bring Fruit Stand over and said, Fruit Stand, do you know what bus you go on? He didn't answer him. He said, Fruit Stand, do you know where your bus stop is? Didn't answer. Well, they were used to this situation too. What they had was on the back of the name tags, they would have the parents write the name of where the bus stop was. So they pulled the name tag off. And a very neat handwriting on the back of the name tag was the word Anthony. Now, that's what the world has done to us, friends. They have thrown a name tag on you, and they just keep calling you that name until you begin to accept that as your identity. And so you've heard that you're a failure, and you've heard that you're not loved, and you heard that you're not worth much, and you heard you should have done something different, and you heard you should have been something more, and you should have more. And you're all these things, these labels that the world keeps putting on your name tag. And some of you have heard them so much that you believe them. And you have begun to find your identity in it. And what Jesus is saying to you today is, I need you to flip the name tag over. Because that is not who you are to me. That is not the name that I've given you. That is not what I went to Calvary for you to believe about yourself. Because what you should find value in more than anything else is that cross. That tells you the value that each and every one of you has. That Jesus would bear that cross for you. That the chosen one, the anointed one, Creator, the King of all creation loves you that much. Let that be what gives you your value. Let that be your identity. And let nothing that this world has to say about you, as true as you may think it might be, resonate with your hearts more than the truth of what Jesus has said about you and what he has done for you. He is telling you today, you don't have to be all those things that you believe that you are or that the world believes that you are. You can be known as a child of God, as one of his, as a part of his family. This passage shows us that Jesus was given the wrong labels when he was here. He was misunderstood. He was called far worse than Elijah and John the Baptist. He was called a blasphemer and a liar, that he was from Satan himself. And people tried to throw those labels on him. But he never lost focus on who he was. Now Jesus is saying to us that he went to the cross and lost his identity so that you might have one. As the worship team comes up this morning, we have seen the answers to these questions that we ask. Who is Jesus and who am I? We have seen them in the cross of Jesus Christ. We understand who Jesus is and what it really means that he was the chosen and anointed one, the King of all creation, through him bearing that cross for us. And we come to understand who we really are as we deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote this in The Cost of Discipleship, which is a book he wrote while he was in prison for standing against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, because he didn't believe that he believed that standing against them was what Christ would do. Here's what he wrote. The cross is laid on every Christian. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give over our lives to death. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Understand what he's saying here. Surrender and sacrifice is not the end of your journey with Jesus. Surrender and sacrifice, the cross, is the beginning of your journey with Jesus. When you are willing to give up yourself, to surrender yourself, to surrender who you are, your will, your way, that's when you can find who Jesus is. That's who you can find who you are in him. That's what we're called to in this moment, surrender. The call to die to ourselves so that we can finally live. And so as we close, let that be our prayer. As we sing the words of the song, I Surrender, may these words become the heartbeat of our faith, that we might lose ourselves and find our true identity in Christ. If you've made that choice and you're following him in that way, may this be your prayer today, because this is daily lived surrender. This is a choice we have to remake every day, to deny ourselves and our will, to not listen to the voices of the world, and to understand who we are in light of the cross. But if you've never made that surrender, and you've allowed the world to tell you who you are, and you want to hear that voice of Jesus call you into his family, to embrace you and welcome you home, you can surrender today to him and find a life that he has for you that you can never find on your own. Our prayer team will be here to pray that with you. I encourage you to come forward and do that today, to surrender and begin your journey with Jesus and find new life in him. Let us stand and sing this prayer today, that we surrender our all to him.